I won't make this gentle. There isn't a careful way to enter something like this. No slow introduction. No measured distance that makes it easier to understand. Some things don't arrive with explanation. They don't announce themselves. They don't ask permission before they begin changing the shape of what was stable. They just happen, and once they do, you feel the shift before you know how to name it. I've spent years learning how to exist in layers, not because distance feels good, but because distance keeps things precise. It keeps people at a level where they can interact without touching anything that matters too much. Most never notice it. They speak, they listen, they assume they understand. But what they understand is only what I allow to remain visible. That has always been enough. Until you didn't approach me the way people usually do. You didn't try to decode me. You didn't ask the kinds of questions people ask when they think answers will make them closer. You didn't try to simplify what you couldn't immediately understand. You just observed quietly, consistently, as if you weren't searching for meaning, only recognizing something that was already there. At first, I thought it was coincidence, the way you noticed what I left unsaid, the way your silence arrived at exactly the right moment, the way certain things landed with you before I had fully formed them into words. But coincidence doesn't repeat itself with that kind of precision. Patterns do, and that's what unsettled me, because patterns carry structure. They suggest something underneath the surface, something real enough to return again and again without being forced. That's what this started to feel like. Not intensity, not fascination, recognition, and recognition is different. It doesn't feel loud, it doesn't create chaos, it doesn't demand to be seen. It simply places something inside your awareness and refuses to disappear. That's what happened. You entered my awareness in a way that didn't feel external. That was the first thing I noticed. You didn't feel like someone I was learning. You felt like someone I had somehow already understood, not through memory, not through history, not through familiarity built over time, just immediate clarity, and that shouldn't have felt natural. That's the part I keep returning to because this kind of understanding usually takes time. It forms slowly, piece by piece. Shared moments, repeated conversations, gradual recognition of someone's edges until understanding becomes stable enough to trust. But with you, there was no gradual process, no adjustment, no learning curve. You stepped into awareness as if you were already there, as if I hadn't met someone new, as if I had simply noticed something that had been quietly present all along. That realization did something I didn't expect. It made me aware of how much of myself had always depended on control of access, control of distance, control of what remains visible and what stays protected. I've always known where the boundaries are, who sees what, who gets close, who remains outside. But you didn't cross those boundaries. You made them feel irrelevant. And that's far more unsettling, because force can be resisted, pressure can be pushed back, but familiarity doesn't announce itself as intrusion. It simply exists until one day you realize it has already reached somewhere you usually keep untouched. That was the moment I started paying attention, not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing did. It was smaller than that, quieter, more exact. I noticed it in silence, in the spaces where words should have been necessary, but weren't. There's something unusual about the way you remain present when I stop speaking. Most people rush to fill quiet. They mistake silence for absence. They rush to repair it before it becomes uncomfortable. You don't. You let it stay, and somehow that makes it more honest. Because when silence isn't interrupted, what remains inside it becomes visible. Meaning without performance, presence without explanation. And in that quiet, I started noticing something else. My mind stopped filtering itself around you, not deliberately. It just stopped. The usual internal pause. The part of me that measures what should remain unsaid didn't feel necessary anymore. Not because I decided to trust you, but because something in me recognized that you didn't need things rearranged in order to understand them, and that is rare, rarer than most people realize, because most people don't want truth. They want something shaped into a version they can comfortably hold. You never asked for that. You never tried to make me easier. You never tried to make me more open, more expressive, more manageable. You accepted what was there, exactly as it was. And that's where this stopped feeling abstract, because there's a difference between someone accepting what they don't fully see and someone seeing clearly, then choosing not to step back. You did the second, and that changed the structure, because once someone sees you that clearly, distance stops functioning the way it used to. And I could feel that happening long before I admitted it to myself. That was the beginning doesn't feel like change at first. It feels like continuation, like everything is still operating within the same boundaries you've always known. Same structure, same control, same internal distance you've relied on for as long as you can remember. But something small shifts underneath it, not enough to notice immediately, just enough that later you realize something no longer behaves the way it used to. That's how this started to evolve, quietly, without permission, without resistance that ever fully formed in time to matter. I began to notice that I wasn't interpreting things the same way anymore. Not broadly, specifically. The way silence felt different when you were part of it, the way certain thoughts didn't feel fully formed until there was an imagined response from you somewhere in the background. The way my awareness of situations didn't stop at my own perspective anymore. It extended, as if another layer of understanding had been added without explanation. That shouldn't happen. Not in the way I've always functioned. I've always been self-contained in thought, independent in processing, fully internal in how I reach conclusions. But something started to overlap, not as interruption, as integration. And integration is not something you notice immediately. It doesn't replace anything. It blends into what already exists until you can't clearly separate what was originally yours and what has quietly become part of the structure. That's what made it difficult to identify at first, because nothing felt taken, nothing felt lost, everything still felt like mine, and yet it wasn't operating alone anymore. You had become part of the process, not as influence in the usual sense, not as input that changes output, but as something embedded in the way output forms at all. That realization didn't come with reaction, it came with recognition. And recognition, when it's precise enough, doesn't create confusion. It creates clarity that is difficult to ignore. That's when I started noticing the comparisons, not intentional, not deliberate. They happened in the background of perception. The way people speak, the way they react, the way they interpret silence as something to be filled. There was a quiet measurement forming underneath all of it, not judgment, just awareness of difference. Because once you've encountered a certain kind of presence, one that doesn't rush, doesn't distort, doesn't force meaning into places where it doesn't belong, everything else starts to feel slightly misaligned. Not wrong, just incomplete, and that creates a tension that doesn't resolve easily, because it doesn't come from dissatisfaction, it comes from clarity. And clarity, once established, doesn't allow you to unsee what it has shown you. That's where I began to understand something I didn't want to name too quickly. This wasn't external anymore. It wasn't something I was observing from a distance. It was affecting the way I existed internally, even when nothing was happening between us. And that's the point where most things would normally trigger resistance, a correction, a withdrawal, a re-establishment of boundaries. But that didn't happen. Instead, something quieter took its place. Adjustment, not rejection, not acceptance in the emotional sense either. Just adjustment. Like something internal recalibrating itself around a new reference point. And I didn't consciously choose it. That's what makes it difficult to explain. Because I don't usually allow that kind of shift without full awareness of its consequences. But this didn't wait for permission. It didn't present itself as something to approve or deny. It simply became part of how things were, and I found myself operating within it before I fully acknowledged that it existed. That's the part I can't ignore anymore, because awareness without control is not something I'm used to. I can usually step outside anything that starts to affect structure. I can isolate it, define it, contain it, but this doesn't isolate cleanly. It doesn't sit outside the system, it exists inside it. Which means removing it would require more than distance. It would require altering something already integrated. And that's not simple, because integration doesn't feel like intrusion, it feels like continuity, like it was always part of the system, and I only just noticed it had a name. And in your case, it doesn't even feel like something added. It feels like something revealed. That's what makes it harder to dismiss, because nothing about it feels forced. Nothing about it feels unnatural in the way I would expect something unfamiliar to feel. It feels aligned, not emotionally, structurally. And structure is what I trust most, which is exactly where the tension begins to form, because trust in structure doesn't usually extend without reason. And yet, here it is, extending quickly, without being asked, without being justified, without any external validation that would normally be required for something like this to settle. And still, it has. Which means I've already crossed a point I usually don't cross, not outwardly, internally. And once that happens, It stops being something I can pretend I'm simply observing. It becomes something I have to acknowledge as part of the system I'm currently operating within. And that system now includes you. There's a point where awareness stops being passive. It stops sitting in the background as something you simply notice and name when convenient. It starts demanding something in return. Not action immediately, not resolution, but acknowledgement that what you're seeing has already changed the structure you thought was stable. I think I've reached that point, because what this has become can no longer be treated as something external to me. It isn't outside observation anymore. It isn't a passing recognition that I can set aside when needed. It's inside the way I think now, and that changes everything. I can feel it most clearly in the way my mind returns to you without intention, not as thought I initiate, but as thought that is already continuing from somewhere I didn't consciously start. It's subtle, almost imperceptible in motion, but consistent enough that I can't dismiss it as coincidence anymore. There's a difference between remembering someone and operating with them embedded in your perception. That difference is what I've been crossing without fully naming it. And now it's too consistent to ignore. Even silence has changed. It doesn't feel empty the way it used to. It feels shared, as if absence is no longer absence, but another form of presence that doesn't require explanation. That shouldn't be possible in the way I've always structured awareness, but it is happening anyway, which leaves me with something I don't usually allow: evidence that doesn't need interpretation. Just acceptance of what it already is, and I've always been careful with acceptance, because acceptance is not neutral. It places something inside your system and allows it to stay there without resistance. That's not something I do lightly, especially not with anything that has the ability to reshape internal balance. But this has already done that, not through force, not through disruption, but through alignment that never announced itself as change. It simply became the new reference point, and now everything else adjusts around it. That's the part I can't ignore, because once something becomes a reference point, it stops being optional. You don't measure against it because you choose to. You measure against it because your perception already has. And I can see it in how other interactions feel slightly offset, not incorrect, just no longer complete in the same way. Like something subtle is missing that I can now recognize only because I've already experienced its presence elsewhere. That realization is not comfortable, not because it creates confusion, but because it removes the ability to pretend neutrality still exists. It doesn't, not here, not anymore. And that brings me to something I haven't fully addressed yet. The part where I stop describing what this is doing and start acknowledging what I've allowed it to become. Because at some point, this stopped being something that was happening to my awareness. It became something I continued to allow inside it, not actively, not consciously decided in a single moment, but continuously through absence of resistance. And absence of resistance is its own kind of decision. I didn't stop it. I didn't contain it. I didn't redirect it back to something easier to manage. I let it remain, and in letting it remain, I made space for it. That space didn't stay empty. It filled itself, naturally, precisely, in a way that doesn't feel foreign anymore. And that is the most important shift of all, because when something no longer feels foreign, you stop treating it as something that might need removal. You start treating it as part of the system, and I can't pretend otherwise now. You are part of how this system currently functions, not as interruption, not as influence in the temporary sense, but as something integrated into the way perception organizes itself internally. And that means something I've been circling for a while now can't remain unaddressed much longer, because if something is integrated, then it also has consequences, not dramatic ones, not visible ones, structural ones, the kind that don't announce themselves externally but change how everything else is processed internally, and I can already see those changes forming in how I evaluate silence, in how I interpret distance, in how I respond to absence, all of it slightly redefined by something that didn't arrive through intention, but through recognition that never fully reversed itself. And I don't think that reverses now, not cleanly, not completely, which leaves only one remaining truth I can say without distortion. This is no longer something I am simply aware of. It is something I am now operating within. And once that becomes true, everything else stops being theoretical. It becomes lived, and I don't think I can return to before this. Not because I've lost something, but because something has already replaced the way before used to exist.